The major problem that I have is the defining of the trans existence in suffering, specifically from gender dysphoria. Because I happen to believe that there is more to being trans than suffering from gender dysphoria. Now, the alleviation of said suffering from gender dysphoria is a stepping stone in the trans experience for most trans people. But that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of being trans is not the alleviation of gender dysphoria. It is the achieving of gender euphoria, of self-actualization, of being the person you want to be, who you know yourself to be, and being seen as society as said person. Is calling them grifters considered rude? Well, it depends on who you mean, right? Like, there are detransitioners out there, and oftentimes detransitioners don't turn the fact that their path in life in regards to transition involve detransition. They don't make that their political activism and weaponize that to restrict access to trans healthcare to the rest of the trans population who is not detransitioning and is unlikely to, given the statistics that we have. However, there are a substantial vocal minority of detransitioners out there, like Chloe Cole, for instance, that seem to weaponize their identity as a detransitioner in order to try to make it so that nobody can get access to trans healthcare. And that, I can say, in so few words, is cringe. People who identify as detransitioners instead of just cis are a lot of the time grifters? Maybe. So, to be cis just means you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. To be trans means you do not, right? So, technically, if you detransition, you are more than likely going to be cis. But I feel like you've got additional experience from having transitioned that doesn't make you like the average cis person, obviously. In fact, you're probably more solid in your identity than the average trans person because you've had to think about it so much from first deciding to transition and then deciding to detransition, right? So, like, you're a cis person of different experience, I'll say. And I say all that to say that I think it's fine to identify as somebody who is detransitioned. It's just unfortunate that the word detransitioner has the negative stigma that the right, who wants to essentially get rid of the idea of being trans from society and trans people from society, have weaponized that term and made it to kind of have an unfortunate connotation. Also, I don't know, I think the term detransition by itself is kind of negative in the framing for like the term itself semantically. Because like you've transitioned in your gender, so you transition to a gender that you're not assigned at birth. And then when you detransition, I guess, when you identify as cis again and go through the process of getting to be the person you want to be, to go back, I guess, involves a lot of the same steps and a lot of the same medicine and medical professionals and all this kind of shit that transitioning in the first place does. You're still, talking to endocrinologists. You're still talking to your doctor, ideally, in a system that has trans healthcare available. It's a lot of the same kind of processes. So, like, retransition is a word that I have thought of before. But I think semantically, I don't think that would make sense, right? Because, like, to retransition would be to say that you're transitioning again, which I guess could be true, but might not be true to, like, most people's experience. Like, if I think of the word retransition, I think, like, you've detransitioned, I guess, and then you're transitioning again. Like, what most people who detransition, studies have shown, actually end up doing. Because most people who detransition do so because of negative societal pushback. They do so because of financial strain because they can't afford their healthcare or lack of access to that healthcare. Not because they're not actually trans, but because they can't, for whatever of those factors, continue with their transition, so they end up detransitioning. So once they have the ability to do so again, they end up retransitioning in the future. That kind of makes sense to me when it comes to the word retransition in this context. It doesn't seem to be as good for people who were previously transitioning to a gender they did not identify as at birth and are now understanding themselves to actually be cis and having to go through the process of getting back to that point about who they want to be. Yeah, no. But I mean, because bigots can do nothing original ever, they have to essentially colonize the terms and words that the groups that they seek to oppress have adopted or created, and detransition, I think, is just another one of those words. So that said, I don't actually know about the etymology of detransition. Because, like, unfortunately, the vocal minority of detransitioners are the activists who want to get rid of trans healthcare for everybody because of their own negative experiences, and often they get money from groups that are trying to get rid of trans healthcare. So, like, I don't know. So on Tumblr, people are calling it transition too instead. Yeah, I don't know. I think you also need to consider mentality. Well, yeah, you could also separate detransition, I guess, into social and medical, right? Social transition does not involve medical intervention, i.e. hormones or surgeries. So if you have ceased taking your hormones, for instance, because you can't access them anymore, but you still are socially transitioned, you are technically detransitioning, I guess, medically, and often that's against your will and not what you want, the amount of evidence we have for that. So there's that as well, too. How do you feel about gender dysphoria? It's cringe. You should do what you can to deal with it positively. All right. Yeah, the philosophytube drama can be summed up very succinctly. On philosophytube's side, what she wrote on Twitter was not the most, rhetorically effective, in my opinion. And also, because of this, and a general problem that people on Twitter and online have, charitability is dead, and the internet killed it. And probably it's been done before the internet, too, let's be honest. Like, I don't know what people's obsession with reading something from a person that you might otherwise agree with the thoughts and opinions on, reading them saying a thing that you might disagree with, and then immediately looking for the worst possible interpretation of what they said, instead of, I don't know, taking into account the context of their broader body of work, their other opinions and thoughts on the subject that they put out in the public before that point, do some research into the thoughts or opinions they might have on the topic that are more fleshed out than a Twitter comment. And then make a decision from there about how you're going to interpret what they've said. Ask for clarity, perhaps, and things like that. But that would require you to be a normal, rational, reasonable person. So that might be a bit too much. Because, like I said, it really just seems like Abigail was not very rhetorically efficient in what she was saying, and a bunch of people with traumatic experience with gender dysphoria felt invalidated by their misinterpretation of what she was saying because of the lack of rhetorical efficiency of said post, and it just turned into a bunch of shit. Yeah, I know, Shade. I've had a similar take for a long time, because certain people online have tried to invalidate my identity as trans because I identify as non-binary. And I've had to, fight off the trans medicalists before and whatnot. And I still get smoke from the trans medicalists. I'm on HRT. I have been for more than a year now. But I don't, feminize my voice because I don't really care to. And some people would say, oh, well, you're not really, And I just disagree with that line of argumentation. Frankly, it doesn't sound too coherent. And my behaviors, my personality are not very feminine either, as you can see. I'm very tomboy in that way. So I've had a similar take for a long time, and I've been talking about it for a long time. The general crux of the argument is this: the majority of trans people are going to have gender dysphoria. It's likely. It's very likely. Gun to your head, you get shown a trans person, and you're asked, do they have gender dysphoria, or have they suffered from gender dysphoria, yes or no? Your highest chances of survival in that scenario is to say, yeah, probably. Again, you'll probably be right. But not everybody does. And the major problem that I have is the defining of the trans existence in suffering, specifically from gender dysphoria. Because I happen to believe that there is more to being trans than suffering from gender dysphoria. Now, the alleviation of said suffering from gender dysphoria is a stepping stone in the trans experience for most trans people. But that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of being trans is not the alleviation of gender dysphoria. It is the achieving of gender euphoria, of self-actualization, of being the person you want to be, who you know yourself to be, and being seen as society as said person. That is the ultimate goal. Yeah, exactly, CDRCH. It is a problem a lot of oppressed groups face. Women are not defined by their suffering. Black and brown people are not defined by their oppression. There is more to being these marginalized identities than the suffering that they experience. In an ideal scenario, those oppressed groups would not be oppressed, would not be marginalized, and would then not suffer on the basis of that identity, and their identity as black, brown, woman, trans, queer, whatever, would still exist. They would still have those identities. They wouldn't be suffering anymore as much as we possibly could. And the idea that a person being trans requires gender dysphoria invalidates the identity of being trans, right? Or being a woman. Like, if we were to live in the idealized society where we have equality for men, women, and all other gender identities, but specifically in this case for women, if women are no longer suffering in society on the basis of their marginalized status as women, do they cease to be women? I don't think so. I think you would have to give me a really, really good argument to say that women would no longer exist. Frankly, a lot of misogynists, rather, would be very excited about achieving equality if that was the case, right? Women are still going to exist in the absence of their suffering. So the idea that their suffering is what defines them is ridiculous. It is an inherently oppressive line of argumentation. And it's the same for trans people. The alleviation of gender dysphoria is a stepping stone to the ultimate goal of being trans, which is self-actualization. Alleviating gender dysphoria is not the ultimate goal. So what Abigail is talking about is not that people don't feel dysphoric about their gender identity and how they are perceived in society and how they perceive themselves. It is that the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is what is been, made up in so few words. People still feel dysphoria about their gender, but the way that it is diagnosed and medicalized is what Abigail is saying is the more made-up part. She's saying that that is often used to continue the oppression of trans people. It is used to gatekeep care from trans people, especially in the UK, which is the context of what she's talking about because she's a fucking Brit. Like, the amount of hoops and hurdles you have to go through in the UK, bruv, in order to get your trans healthcare, to get a gender dysphoria diagnosis, is absurd. That's what the commentary is on. Now, the major argument that I'll hear in response to that is, oh, well, if in the absence of the gender dysphoria diagnosis, well, isn't that the main linchpin that allows trans people to get those procedures, hormones, surgeries, etc., covered by insurance? My answer to you is this. I hate the health insurance companies more than you do, motherfucker. I'm trying to nationalize the health insurance and healthcare industry and utilizing taxpayer dollars like every other comparable OECD nation has figured out. Obviously not perfectly, but better than us, where we spend more for worse outcomes in the United States. I'm trying to nationalize that shit and expand it so that those things would still be covered, even in the absence of the gender dysphoria diagnosis. So maybe in the immediate short term, having gender dysphoria as a diagnosis can be helpful in getting people in our fucked healthcare system to get their treatments that they might not otherwise be able to get because they don't have the money to do it. It could be helpful in the short term, sure, but I like to think into the future as well. And I don't think philosophytube, I don't think she's advocating that in the immediate short term, we have to make all these changes surrounding gender dysphoria. I think it is a commentary that stretches past the phone screen that is 1 inch in front of your face when you're browsing Twitter and getting mad about shit that you're misunderstanding. I think it's a little deeper than that. I will say again, the rhetoric that she used was subpar, not very good. But it is also Twitter. However, that's not really much of an excuse. Anyway, even then we could approve the defining of dysphoria diagnosis and such in the short term, enemies get left out. As you said, euphoria is left out. Well, that's the other thing, is that there are so many trans people out there that essentially play the game when it comes to getting their gender dysphoria diagnosis or whatever so they can get their hormones and whatnot covered by insurance, who will overemphasize the kinds of dysphoria they feel or the way dysphoria affects their life because they know if they're actually truthful that, yes, this does still bug me, and I do think it would be a massive quality of life increase for me to get access to said treatments. And I don't have the money for it, unfortunately, so I need the insurance to do that. they end up having to exaggerate a variety of things about themselves in order to actually get that diagnosis and then get the life-saving, oftentimes, healthcare, right? I have felt this way as well. Luckily for me, I am in a privileged position being in trans mecca of the United States of America, Seattle, Washington, though Minnesota's kind of getting us a little bit there. Minnesota's actually been quite based recently on trans issues. So I'm in a fortunate position where it was actually, for me, as, like, I will say, at the time, 26-year-old adult human being, it was relatively easy for me to get my hormones covered by my insurance and all this kind of shit. I didn't have to go through as many hoops and hurdles, but I still felt the implicit pressure. And what is involved in this conversation as well is, well, what do trans people do in the absence of their healthcare, right? Like, and then, of course, you move into the, oh, well, what if you got it through third-party channels, DIY, HRT, etc., etc., which a lot of people have to turn to, not just for trans healthcare, but as we've seen, also reproductive healthcare. Like abortions. Wow. It turns out, if you illegalize and restrict heavily access to oftentimes life-saving and medically necessary care, people will still try to get the care through third-party channels. So, if you do not like the idea of, say, people getting back alley abortions or buying their estrogen and testosterone blockers online, you're gonna have to be one of the biggest advocates for expanding access to trans healthcare that I have ever seen. And trying to gatekeep access to said care through the medicalization of trans people vis-a-vis gender dysphoria is kind of the opposite of that, right? The banning of abortion doesn't make abortion less common, it just makes safe abortions less common. The banning of trans healthcare doesn't make trans healthcare less common, it just makes regulated trans healthcare less common. Now, that said, DIY HRT is not often like a fucking witch with a cauldron brewing estradiol valerate in your bathtub. It's usually buying it from third-party channels, often from regulated sources if you can, and then matching your dosages to the medical standards. And then, if you can, getting blood work done, because there are places you could do that without insurance, etc., and then tracking your levels that way, on your own. The DIY aspect of DIY HRT is not crafting and synthesizing estradiol like Walter White. The DIY part is the obtaining of said medicine and the dosing of it. And some people seem to have a misunderstanding about that. Like, I would agree. I would prefer that all people got their hormones from regulated sources and were having them prescribed to them from doctors whose theoretical job it is to know a lot about the shit. That said, from a lot of what I've heard from other people who've had to DIY, they end up knowing a lot more than the doctors they talk to because trans healthcare, trans science is woefully understudied, woefully underfunded, and often illegal. Wow, would you look at that? So an all-out expansion of trans healthcare, of studies into trans healthcare, is necessary if you do not find it comfortable, the idea that people are DIYing their HRT dosages. And if I see any kind of incongruence in that, then it makes me question your opinions on the topic. Trans studies literally were destroyed as well in the past. Yeah, I seem to remember some authoritarian regime led by some Austrian guy who got rid of a lot of that trans science. Maybe. I think that happened. Oh, yeah, and the final part of this discourse, I guess, for me personally, is, once again, most trans people are likely to suffer from gender dysphoria. However, in the smaller percentage chance that someone doesn't suffer from gender dysphoria, but also doesn't identify as their gender assigned at birth, i.e. they are trans, and they want to get hormones to look how they want, as it corresponds to how they want to look and their gender identity. Why the fuck do I care? You cannot force me to give a damn about somebody doing that. You can't. I'm sorry. I don't give a shit. If somebody does not have gender dysphoria, but still wants hormones or surgeries to look the way they want, why do I care? You're gonna have to give me an argument to care. Because I'm not weird. I'm a normal human being, and I don't give a fuck what people do with their lives as long as they're not hurting anybody. That's it. I'm a big fan of individual liberty. I'm a big fan of freedom, brother. That's why I was born in the goddamn United States of America and not the UK where they got socialism. I'm a big fan of freedom, bodily autonomy. So I've not found a compelling argument for why I should give a shit. Now, of course, all of what I've said in this is going to be in regards to adults, right? People over the age of medical consent who are making these decisions on their own. When it comes to trans minors, people under the age of medical consent, then an expansion of healthcare, like I've talked about previously, would also help with that. Because there are children out there, shockingly, I know. And they're not potentially as educated on a lot of these things and are still kind of working through it on their own. They don't have as much life experience, all this kind of stuff. The cool thing about that is that you can solve for that with the intervention of knowledgeable adults, like medical doctors, mental health doctors, the parents, ideally they are supportive, the child themselves, because children, contrary to popular belief, are not automatons or the property of their parents. They are also human beings who have their own thoughts, feelings, and opinions. Now, they might not be as educated because they don't have as much life experience, because they haven't been able to look at all the shit, yada, yada, yada. That's why the professionals are there. Ideally, in a system that has adequate trans healthcare, you would have what is standard for these standards of care, a very long process for trans youth, starting with social transition. So that means, before you get scary, we're not chopping off limbs, all right? This is not the mutilation and castration, brother. It's not happening. Social transition, which is trying out different pronouns. So scary. A different name, maybe. Wow, Jose wants to be Josefina? Good heavens, that is the fall of Western civilization. Wearing different clothes, oftentimes clothes that are not typical for their gender assigned at birth, right? That kind of thing. And then you go through usually a years-long process up until, they get around the age of their puberty and be like, oh, well, do they still appear to be trans? Let's talk to the medical doctors that have been tracking this. Let's talk to the mental health doctors that have been tracking this. Let's talk to the parents who have been tracking this. Let's talk to the child themselves who have been tracking this. Find out they are, or it is likely they are. Okay, well then, puberty blocker time, which have virtually zero negative side effects and are reversible. You put them on puberty blockers, which buys them a little bit more time to still kind of figure it out. If it turns out that they are trans, well, then you go on HRT and whatnot from then. However, that all is going to work. And then if they're not, you take them off the puberty blockers. They go through the puberty of their gender assigned at birth, and they're chilling. Could be mildly later than it might have otherwise been, but puberty blockers have been used for the treatment of precocious puberty in cis children for a long time, longer than they have been used for trans kids. So, seems like they're pretty safe. And bada bing, bada boom. You're schmoovin'. Anyway. Are you a narcist? Do you mean like a narco? I do not traffic drugs, brother man. I don't know what you're asking me. Do I narc on people? No, not usually. Depends on who I'm narking to, I guess. I'll narc to God. God damn it. I will tell God on you, motherfucker. If you restrict trans healthcare from people, for instance. Narcissist? Why do you ask? I don't think I'm any more narcissistic than the average person. If you think about it, it's pretty narcissistic to want to restrict access to trans healthcare from trans people because it makes you feel uncomfortable that trans people exist. That's kind of putting your thoughts, feelings, and opinions at a higher level of import than theirs, of a different experience, right? That's pretty narcissistic if you ask me. They're fucking stupid. They are mentally redacted. The first message they sent, you should have been able to tell that this person was unwell. So this is an old talking point. This is the same talking point that has been used about any person fighting for liberation under oppressive systems. The same thing was said, oh, these narcissistic black people who want to be able to use the same water fountain as everybody else. Why can't they just be happy with their separate water fountain? They're so narcissistic. It's the same shit. Oh, these narcissistic women that just want to be able to open their own bank accounts and be able to go and work a job that they want to work and not have to be tied down to a man to do everything. These narcissistic women. It's the same shit. It's just a bad faith way, because they're literally a troll, and I'm just going to use this to, elucidate this point. It is just a bad faith way to discredit the legitimate thoughts, feelings, and opinions of an oppressed group fighting for their liberation and make them seem less serious in the public eye. That's all that it is. Everyone cares about their looks? Yeah, of course. That's why I say I don't think I'm any more narcissistic than the average person. We all like to feel good about ourselves. We all want to look good in whatever way looking good means to us. The idea that trans people are special in that way is ridiculous. Now, of course, if you were so worried about the narcissism that you suspect trans people have because they have a focus on their aesthetics, well, then there's a way to fix that. And the way to fix that would be to, 1, expand access to healthcare for trans people so that they can look the way that they want and feel happy and actualized about themselves. And 2, move social views of trans people away from stigmatization and no longer make people feel bad about being trans. Because a lot of what involves trans people's negative thoughts, feelings, or opinions of their own looks, and then the things they do to alleviate those concerns, not entirely, but in part involve social interactions that they have. Not only do trans people do what they do in order to look the way that they want for themselves, which is the most important part, self-actualization, but secondarily to that, they also want to be seen in society as the person that they want to be seen as the person that they are. So if you move social views of trans people away from oppressive views and stigmatized views and towards positive ones, i.e. trans people are people like everybody else and deserve respect like everybody else, then those trans people will be seen as less narcissistic in your eyes. You have created the problem that you seem to misdiagnose in trans people. But like I say, there's nothing more narcissistic than trundling into my chat room and thinking that your opinion is worth anything. You are just a chatter like the rest of us. Now, I do have an elevated position being the streamer, but you could go to another chat room, and I might be in that chat room, and then I'm just one of you. Did I say otherwise? No, I'm saying you're a pussy. I'm saying you're a coward. I'm saying that you're utilizing this weird medicalization of narcissism that you've misdiagnosed in trans people as a way to advocate for negative outcomes for trans people. I know that's what you mean. I know that's your ultimate goal, and I know you're using this kind of argument in order to get to that, but that's just because you are a pussy, you are a coward, you are bitch-made, you're a little worm who is too scared to actually say your real thoughts, opinions on the topic, and are utilizing this weird, aren't all trans people narcissists, in order to try to get the entry point into that conversation. Come back in a day, brother, man. We gotta move on. Yeah, man couldn't even spell narcissist. Your entire brain fits inside of mine. I have downloaded the entirety of your neural network. It is in here. I've heard it all before. Nothing that you write to me is going to be new. I play along with it because it's good content somehow, but I've seen it all. I've downloaded you. This video is kind of called a streamer friend of the show and critical racing theorist, Beer Bash Johnson. Thanks so much for the support, as always, and keep on chugging. If you'd like to be the next Connor Callout, all you can do is follow me on Twitter, @ConnorCC, retweet my video links when they go live, remember to subscribe to the channel, put all notifications on when you hit the bell, leave a like if you'd like, comment something down below about how trans people are super cool, and the alleviation of gender dysphoria, should they have them, is a human right, and have a good day.